Thank you for watching another Energy Curators Talk at Mori Art Museum. We are joined by Martin Germann, independent curator, and Mami Kataoka, the director of Mori Art Museum in charge of planning exhibition Another Energy today, and myself, Tokuyama Hirokazu, associate curator at Mori Art Museum as a moderator. Martin is joining us online from Germany today. Hello. Hello, Martin.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. So first of all, I'd like to give a brief introduction of Martin. Martin lives and works in Cologne. After studying in Berlin and Potsdam, he worked for the third and fourth Berlin Biennial for the contemporary art in 2003 and 2005. He later was a curator at Bueno Friedrich Berlin from 2006 to 2007. And from 2012 and to 2019, he led the artistic department at SUMAC, Ghent, as a senior curator, where he organized numerous collection, group, and solo exhibitions. Then for Lily Dugery, one of the participating artists at Another Energy, he curated the show called Falls in Time in 2015. He received an AICA award for Belgium Best Exhibition for this show. Okay. And in today's talk, I'd like to hear two curators talk about the concept of the exhibition, the focus on how it started, and also how it developed from 2016 when Mami had an idea of another exhibition, Another Energy in the first time. And I also like to hear about the connection between all diverse participating artists. In the catalog essay, Mami mentions the following three characteristics common to all the artists, which is fluidity and abstraction and responding to the site. And I believe this connection between these artists will be a very good clue to understand the exhibition and its concept. So my first question would be, how did the idea for this exhibition come about? And also, how did it develop after that? So maybe, Mami, you want to start with?
I met Martin February 2015 sometime, and we were in the same curators program in 2016 in Paris to look around the different venues and an artist in Paris. Then at the time, I was preparing for 2018 Sydney Biennale. Then Martin introduced me Lily Dugery, who is also in Another Energy show. And yeah, I remember that at the time already, these senior women artists had been sort of rediscovered at different places. So we were aware that the importance of looking at those sort of overlooked artists from the history. But when I looked at Lily Dugery's the website, which you can also see it now, that such diverse use of different materials, which are more or less classic materials for the sculptures, stone, metal, and clay, and all these materials, and then also paper. But yeah, somehow that was very fascinating to see the tireless, endless exploration of those the different materials and the possibilities of the art making. But then I decided to introduce Lily Dugery to Sydney Biennale. And she came to Sydney and remade her works from 1972. And after 40 years, it just made so much sense to show it today. But Martin, you could probably tell, as you did the solo show for Lily Dugery, and how you could, how you value Lily, and why you introduce her to me.
Well, I think First of all, the show was very, very special because it was not only at SMAC that we were showing Lily, but also at Musée in Ostende, because Lily has two places where she lives and works. It's at the sea and on the countryside, and somehow she didn't wanted that just one institution is doing some kind of a retrospective, which it wasn't really. However, she wanted the institutions to share. And that was, I think, a very special thing, in particular towards the very heroic museum culture in Belgium, so that one artist is kind of forcing in a soft way museums to share the power, so to speak, on her work. And that was a special thing about this show. And this is also probably why we received this award, because museums normally like to insist on their authority. And I think this is also part of her practice in a way, to force and to stimulate and to open situations, while on the other hand the work is very delicate. It touches all the currents in contemporary art, from minimalism over the 80s, when the work became very visual again, and then it went back into itself, while the work on the other hand always stays by itself. And so she's an artist I find quite fascinating, and I know that she's planning a new series since 5 or 6 years already. And I think this is also a very important part of her practice, the pause, that the production does not necessarily mean to produce goods and objects. So like another artist in our show, I think she has a very productive relationship to laziness, to say it like this.
Yeah, then
and
after...
that's and just as a last thought, Lily is like other artists in Belgium, like for example also Raoul de Keyser. I think that there's something very Eastern in their work, which fits somehow into Eastern thinking. And that's also why I at that time proposed her because you told me a little bit what you wanted to do in Sydney.
It's interesting that we are showing a piece called The Balance. And my theme for Sydney Biennale was really about equilibrium. And but after, then Martin came to see my Sydney Biennale for the opening. Then we kind of continue discussing about different great women artists who needs more international attention. And also, we started somehow listing up all these artists, and there are so many. Then we started to discuss maybe it's a great idea to have all of them together in one place.
Yeah, while on the other hand, we were both aware that making a women-only show is something which doesn't really fit to the thinking usually. So somehow we took that really rigid frame, but also to break it, I think. And that's what we probably see later when we walk through the show together.
Yes. So let's take a look at each artist's work from here, following the structure of the exhibition. Okay. The show starts with Philly the Barrel. Okay. And for this show, the Philida make new commission work called Undercover 2. And I'd like to ask, why did you choose bring Philida Barrow at the beginning of the exhibition?
I think it was kind of an obvious choice to have a Philida at the beginning, to encounter something so energetic and full of energy. And we can talk about why we call it another energy sometime later. But Philida was someone very sort of representing all these phenomena of re-evaluation of the senior women artists in the last 10 years. And I saw her quite big solo exhibition in Switzerland. Around the same time, I encountered the Lily Dugeli's work. Then it was massive pieces in full of space and so many materials, and it's just overwhelming amount of the stuff in the room. And who wants to do this kind of almost impossible task? Then I saw artist, and she was born in 1944, and then she was represented in 2017 British Pavilion in Venice Biennale. So her recognition was like sky high in 5 years or so. But yeah, and then also because we didn't plan this COVID situation when we started planning the show, then we were thinking of having her to come here and install something new for the space.
Yeah.
Actually, the process of installing is very interesting in a way that she never draw a construction map, so she always like improvise at the site when she makes her work. So we connect to Philida for like 7 days to construct this massive work. And Martin joined sometime. How did you see installing through Zoom?
Especially, it was very, very interesting to witness an artist like Philida, who normally she's basically also a studio artist, and she suddenly had to direct her compositions and her thoughts and her gestures, because the work lives from gesture, from working on it somehow via Zoom. And that was a very particular situation also because her team could not be at place. And so it was, I think that was one of the unique experiences in a new way to witness that from the outside, because I couldn't say so much about it. But I think it's very interesting to see the installation images, because we can also see what Philida is doing. So we have this basic grid, which is something like a roof, and the grid reminds us, of course, as to modernism, such as the painted canvases and these balls. And so actually this first room is already meshing up everything we connect to academic modernism in a way, and create something new. And she said at some point she wants that all these things looking like lava floating towards us. And I like that that comparison a lot, that she also thinks her work in registers like this, in natural registers.
It was also interesting to hear how she verbalized what she's always doing spontaneously. And that was also the reason of frustration that she sometimes felt during the walking, because the Zoom is actually two-dimensional. So she couldn't really see the space behind the balls and some of the canvases. So it was challenging for her, challenge for us, but it was also showing Philida balancing between theory and actual tactile feeling and art making, and like a physical making.
It was also interesting that the Philida was, when we interviewed with her for the artist video, she was very skeptical about conceptualism and really traditional sculpture in the Western art world. So I think it's kind of rare for Western, like British artists who practice more than like 50 years, that like all the artists around her, maybe like there's a trend like YBA and conceptualism art. But how do you see Martin? How do you see like is it kind of rare for Western artists who are skeptical about conceptualism or actually the art historical context?
I think there's, of course, you have this extension of academism into conceptual art and into all these into certain categories, and I think that's another connection in our exhibition, that plenty of those artists touch that kind of thinking, but also undermine it with their work. And Phillida is certainly one of those who, in the end, she uses conceptual strategies like working with filling materials, so with material which makes art. So she works with fillers, with the material which normally consists a work. She uses the background as the foreground, so to speak. But she, I think, also the notion of the archive, the notion of process art or of process, which is very important in her work, because a long time the pieces were destroyed afterwards, so they couldn't be remade. So it was sculpture just for the particular moment. And all these, of course, her strategies fit into the registers, but in a very own way, I would say.
I also like the fact that she uses the space to, the sculpture always overwhelm the space. And someone said, oh, this room is too small for this sculpture. But I said, no, if we gave her the bigger space, then she would have made much bigger piece, just to overwhelm any given space. But also, thinking about the title Undercover, it's interesting to see what she's hiding underneath, under all these canvases, and then also we even have 78 bubbles on those the lattice, the structure, wooden structure. But people can go around and start to see the structure from underneath. And so it's interesting to think that she was also trying to explain us, this is more like making a painting on this red lattice, so that the canvas has to look at the paint, like a Gutai or a Jackson Pollock pouring the paint.
Yeah, and it was particularly important for her really to go to the edge. I think the end of the composition was very interesting, because the goal was also to bring all the, I think, 30 balls and 70 canvases, right?
No, it was 78 balls and 33 canvases.
Okay, way around, but to include all material in the work, which is somehow a very precarious game to accomplish. But in the end, it works out. So she likes to touch limits in her work.
It's totally over the top. And we were, like, at the very last, we were leaving probably 4 or 5 bubbles on the floor. But she really wanted to completely put everything up on the roof.
Okay, maybe we can talk another 1 hour about Phillida, but we should move on to next artist.
Yeah.
Okay. The next artist, Annabella Gallo. Matti, you want to start with this wall about her work?
Yeah, Annabella Gallo is from Brazil. She was born in 1933, and she's an artist who started already very early in the 50s. So she's one of those artists who are really starting post-war directly. And she was, of course, under influence of abstraction, of post-war abstraction as a general movement. But suddenly, in the 60s or in the mid 60s, she switched over and made something like mappings of her own body. And so we start our presentation or our room with Annabella with these mappings of not only her, but of bodies in general. And that we confront with mappings of the space, because in 1968, the moon, there was the landing on the moon, and suddenly people could see the Earth from the outside. And I think it's such an interesting juxtaposition of mapping the body and mapping the space, which and in between that, the human being can situate itself. And it shows actually the spectrum, what Annabella is doing throughout her career. It's always about borders, about territory, also speaking about identity, especially in Brazil, where she's she's a Polish Jewish, comes from Polish Jewish immigrant family, and she was always some kind of an outsider within Brazil. And so all these, let's say, categories which make our lives, or which organize our lives, are questioned by Annabella throughout the time in a very delicate, very intense way, I would say. She's also, like Lily, touching many mediums, so which she's in that sense also a post-medium artist, I would say. So she has videos, she has prints, she has painting, and there was a very large sculpture which actually looked like an archaeological dig, which we couldn't realize due to COVID. And I think the work of Annabella is very engaged, politically engaged, in a in a particular way, which is pretty unique also within Brazil. And that's why she's one of the most famous artists also in Brazil. And I think we shouldn't forget that her husband is a geographer. And I think as Philida, I think she has 4 children and Philida 5, I think. That's also something which connects artists, I would say, live.
I also like the fact that we started the internal body to the moon, which really connects with actually Eastern philosophy that internal body has a microcosmos and a larger universe is a macrocosmos. And we consider those two are the same. So it's a beautiful beginning. And then also I found that a shape of Latin America, meaning the South American continent, and the shape of Brazil is somehow a little bit similar. So she keeps using those two forms in different materials and medium. And then also she touched upon the Brazilian indigenous tribe called the Bololo, and using their postcards, and her family tried to pose in the same way. So it's also questioning about the meaning of land and ownership of the land. And yeah, that's one of the connecting points with other artists as well.
Yeah. In her work, I think these categories go back into something very neutral and naked again. So we see many maps and cards. Actually, she's using techniques which also were used by those people or by the colonialists who actually conquered South America in the 15th century. She makes use of those techniques, but in a very ambiguous way. And that's so interesting. So actually land becomes territory again, territory which is not owned by anyone. And with that strategy, she's opening discussion, basically. Especially also, we have to know that she started from 1965, there was a military dictatorship in Brazil. And that was a particular time for artists, and it also influenced artists' works. And this is also why we choose the multiple, or to show so many multiples, to kind of give also a glimpse of what the multiple could mean in that time as a reproduction medium.
Yeah, I think the idea of reproduction or multiplicity or repetition of the images come later when we talk about Alpita and Beatriz Gonzalez. But we can keep that connection until later.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, and also Martin mentioned the political aspect of Annabella Gallo. I think it's really important to mention that those other artists, they all start their career in 1950s and 60s, which is a time of political turmoil. I think it's really important how they politically engage through artwork, because most of them choose the not direct way. It's very abstract, and like Annabella Gallo, it's like it's almost like a poetic. And then could you talk about like some other artists who politically engage in a kind of same way, such as like Senga Nengudi or Beatriz Gonzalez. Maybe Beatriz Gonzalez was more direct, but you want to add some other artists?
Me?
Both?
I think Arpita Singh has also political contents, but because it's beautiful painting and lots of figures and the text, but if you look close, then there is a piece about Sita. It's a heroine in Ramayana epic that are searching for the Sita. So we can look at her image. Yeah, because there are so many young girls missing in the society, so it's a sort of constant news in everyday life. So we're using the name of Sita, but referring to those incidents. And if you look into those details of the combination of text and images, then those political elements and then also the critique to the society is being revealed. But connection with the Phyllida, I think the idea of undercover, which was the title of Phyllida''s work, is to sort of hide something in a secret. And but I think these artists are trying to reveal something that we are not really recognizing in the society in everyday life, but in a very direct, abstract way. But it's sort of like a sign of reading. So once we start reading it, then quite precise the critique for the contemporary society is becoming the foregrounded.
Basically, I think that that there's an element of engagement in all the artists' works we invited, and I don't know if we should jump too much now, but also Kim Sun-gui is an incredibly political work she's doing, as well as Lili Dujury or Ethel Adnan. So you find that element of a certain engagement, but rather engagement in terms of applying soft power and not on the forefront of any political movement. You find what or feminist movement. You find that in all the artists' work. I think that's a connection we have. There's always an engagement not only for one group, so to speak, like women and women's liberation, but to see that kind of political engagement in a larger framework. This is something I realized after a while, that the feminist, maybe the movements of the 60s and 70s, they stimulated the beginning of their practices, but no one stayed there in a way.
I think maybe we can go back to Robin White.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to look at one piece called The Summer Grass, which was in collaboration with the Japanese artist Miss Iyama, Miss Imra. That it's about the story in New Zealand during the World War II. It's called the Featherstone Incident. That there were some Japanese soldiers in New Zealand from Solomon Islands. Then there was a conflict between local New Zealand soldiers and Japanese soldiers, and then over 40 people died. And there was a memorial, like stone memorial, and the Basho's haiku was engraved. Then she learned about that incident. But those historical stories, a little bit political, then it was kind of hidden and not really spoken. So she used the wallpaper, which is normally to hide something underneath or stain on the wall. So she used the backside of the wallpaper to sort of open up something undercover and then told us that story. So it's an interesting connection from the Phyllida. But also yeah, she wanted to really engage with the site and the land and the history where she was going to live.
Okay. So the following structure of exhibition, we should move on to Suzanne Lacy.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Here. I think Suzanne has something in common with Robin White, that Robin's and Suzanne Lacy's work are collaborative in nature. So maybe we can start talking about Suzanne Lacy from this point of view.
I think I want to mention about this idea of undercover or revealing something underneath. And this piece called Inevitable Association from 1976, that there was it was a reaction, the performative reaction to the fact that the local Los Angeles classic hotel called Biltmore Hotel, they were going to do the larger renovation. And then all this newspaper headline said, Grand Old Lady Hotel is doing a makeup. So she had to react to that fact. And she invited the plastic surgeon to that hotel and made a different booth. And then invited young people to make up in a reversed way, meaning that probably she was in her late 20s or 30. Then I think, no, she was still early 20s at the time. And she got her makeup to become 60 years old. Then all other people joined. So there are loads of looking old ladies lined up on the chairs. And then the second day of the performance, they all discussed about the meaning of the aging and what do we do when we become 60. So that is a kind of reaction to those idea of making up. But then she is probably the most direct figure who were part of the feminism movement in 60s and 70s, more or less from 70s. But she always has this funny humor, and also the visual aesthetics are quite important. And that's some continuation from the beginning of the show.
Yeah, and I think also in Susan's works, she's always insisting on form. So
yes.
Probably, I mean, she studied with Judy Chicago, but also with Alan Capro, and probably this kind of this double influence. The work is never only in so to speak a cul-de-sac of feminism, of only engaging for one thing. It's rather about both. It's also about, in the end, also about form, about sculpture, and that's so interesting that it can switch the layers.
Also, this piece goes between the doors and the street, that she actually did the performance project on one street in Brooklyn, New York in 2013 to invite almost 400 people to talk about feminism, but also race, labor, body, and all sorts of things. And this is really showing how idea of feminism is multi-faced now, and they're not really talking singularly about the gender. And her idea also concern is also not only for the equality of the women, but also for young people and anti-violence, and then all this injustice in the society. So it's so relevant for now, but it has been like this for a long time. And one of the pieces that we can see that the International Dinner Party, which was conducted in 1979 to celebrate Judy Chicago's exhibition at the SF MoMA. But she planned 24 hours dinner party through her network. So she sent an invitation to participate in 24 hours, one day dinner party. Then we can look at quite a few Japanese women group were participating without internet and social media. They were using letters and telegram. So it was quite interesting to see there was already international network of those women and an artist at the time.
Okay, so we should move on to next artist, Ethel Adnan. Okay.
Yeah, Martin, you can talk about Ethel in terms of nature.
Well, Ethel Adnan is also one of those artists who got, I think she became more and more prominent in Europe with Documenta in 2012. And it's basically, we show in our, in the space, we show a mix of her paintings and her leporellos. And this is also to understand her practice as something as not bound to one medium. It's I think at some point she's actually a writer, and she grew up in between the languages, between Arab and between French, in Lebanon. And I think exile, in a certain way, became her own nature. That's how she once told it. So exile lasted so long for her that it became my own nature. And this is also a very political aspect, of course, I think. And also that from her painting and thinking, she always, especially here or in these leporellos, where it's a mix about writing, about image, and about written language. Here it's about trees, for example, which she's drawing in a way. The leporello is an old format from Asia, which kind of came, which was invented, I think, in the 10th century onwards, and came from Japan and China, and it was only it came into Arab countries later on. So she's showing that all cultural artifacts we work with have multiple roots in a certain way. And we see in her room actually the sun, the moon, but also trees, and everything is basically reminds us as to poems, visual poems, written poems, drawn poems.
Yeah, I asked her if she has ever come to Japan, but she said, Japan is inside of me. So she lived through the 50s and 60s in San Francisco, where all this, the influence of Zen philosophy was quite the popular around that time. And looking at those abstract paintings, so to speak, but once we can start sharing her imagination of the landscape of some Northern California and then also her homeland Lebanon, then all those works start looking like a natural landscape.
Yeah. I think this is the one basic criterion of the exile, is that you always imagine another place from your exile. And so what you spoke about was also this. There was this mountain in California, this Mount Tamalpais, which she was, or Mount Tamalpais, she was painting it for years and years and years again, from all angles. I think we don't have those works in the show, but it's really about, if you're in exile, you're always in search for a continuum. And she found that, for example, in that mountain, but also in the sun and in moon. In the moon, so images we have there, actually representations of nature which are always there and which are kind of general. And that's very interesting, I think, how she's turning something very general into something very specific for her.
That's, I think, a connect with the Annabella, that to think about ourselves from the distance of the moon, then if we see the glow from the moon, there is no national boundaries, or no conflict that we can see. So it's interesting to see that our world from that distance.
Yeah, there's also a poetry book which was recently published in Germany. It's translated, "We Became Cosmic." And Ethel was absolutely fascinated and stunned by the discovery of, or by the situation that the first human being could take a step on the moon, on the one hand, but especially also those images, because end of the 60s, we suddenly could see the Earth as a whole, as human beings. And for Ethel, this is actually, she say, with that, we inhabited the space, and we became prehistoric again in our ability to inhabit the space. But that, on the other hand, forces a responsibility of how we live together on the earth. This is so interesting, I thought, as a way to think. So what we often perceive as an end in terms of history now is maybe just the beginning, but it's also connected to responsibility, because the earth will remain the primary home. That's what she wrote. So quite, yeah.
Also, the concern for the natural force or larger nature or kind of scale of the universe is that we can observe in Lily Dujuli's works as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the pieces that we talked about equilibrium and balance, but this piece that we have in the show called The Balance. And this is beautifully like poetic, subtle action of one plate of the iron and then also two iron poles. Yeah, this one. And I was so surprised by installing this piece according to Lily's instruction. They're very simple, and but everyone thought this is quite fragile, and maybe one visitor will hit the pole, then it's not so stable, but it's amazingly stable. And with these the weight of the iron poles, and so it looks fragile and burnable, but actually very, very strong. And I thought this is somehow represent all these women artists, and thinking as an if you start from the identity, the old lady, then normally people easily think that it's fragile and burnable and all these things, but it's very, very strong and powerful. And so I thought this piece was represent the whole.
That's probably also why we put it in that space where we can see the outside of Tokyo. So it's actually the only part of the exhibition where we have a look to the outside. And actually this is, I think, one of the very first sculptural experiments Lily Dujury did in the 60s. In 67, she made that work. And she hardly showed that, but only, I think, in Ostende, then in our retrospective, or in our exhibition, it suddenly came back. And it combines, of course, minimalists, it has a minimalist face, but actually gravity is the true owner of this work.
And we have a beautiful landscape and seascapes. The left-hand side wall, we have teared pieces of paper. I think only 9 pieces or something. And it's really hard to see it from the picture. But if you see it in a real space, it's such a beautiful gesture. And think of, it's a almost new finding what we can do as an art. And then on the opposite wall, unfortunately, I don't think we have a good picture today, but 7 monitors of the seascapes, like ocean landscape, from her house in Ostende. So that's also, the wave goes back and forth for 7 days. Then it's really sort of putting your body or thinking onto the movement of the whole universe. And that's leaving your control, and you cannot really control those movements.
Yeah, and this is also something, maybe we can go back to the image before for 1 second. Because we see another, to the left, we see a plate lying on the wall. It reminds us maybe to Karl André, or maybe even to Malevich, to artists who worked somehow with the square. But what Lily is doing here is she cutted a little slice with in this plate, and this little slice, there's a space which we actually cannot see, and this is and this little cut is also slightly off center, and so I think for her this part we cannot see is maybe the most important part of the work. And so we have another notion of undercover, Maybe because in the 60s, it was what you see is what you get, one thing after the other. And the unseen or the imaginable was a little bit forbidden, at least in the larger trend. And Lily somehow, with this small cut, she worked against that thinking, but in a soft way, so to speak. So I think that work is even important, and especially the combination is quite nice with the four other pieces in that room.
I think Ethel and Lily's poetic expression leads to next artist, Kim Sungi.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Sungi was very interesting artist. That she had a large retrospective at National Museum of Contemporary Art in Korea in 2019, and just before COVID, Martin and I and also Toku could visit the show, and it's enormous diversity of her medium and also what she did, and lots of works that I have never seen. But the poetry is also a part of her practices, and after COVID, she said, actually our human society or civilized society is something that we have to go back and look at the nature and nature of force again. And her thinking is partly based on the Taoism, and which talks about yin and yang, and then also come and go, and everything is flux, and then nothing is stable and solid. So her works is always keep changing, and she actually kept challenging new medium, and she even made a robot and works with AI and the computer algorithm and all of these things. So this new piece that she made for our show, it's called the Forest Poem, is just our suggestion to remind that we are really a small part of the larger universe. And she made 66 programs of, this is the John Cage, but the different poet is reading, reciting the poetry, and then also shooting some images of her garden in the backyard. Then according to the weather of Tokyo, these images changes. So it's again no control or no human control, that it's force of nature that is deciding our path. And according to Martin's very good suggestion that we are having poetry reading on every full moon night, which actually coming next week, the first one.
Yeah, indeed. That's also a part of her project entitled Forest Poem, that there are live streaming performances of people doing poetry readings all full moon days, all 5 full moon days during the runtime of the exhibition. And I think Sungui is also in that respect so interesting that her work reminded us that there were artists before museums, so to speak. So, and she's really creating her own, let's say, anarchist space, or her own institution within the institution, with this new work, with this constantly changing work in permanent flux, which I find so beautiful. And on the other hand, if we take the metaphor of the forest, so all trees are very different, but they have to live together. And that's somehow, I think, the overarching theme of her work, how she described it. So she will constantly produce new work from new video pieces from her garden, it's a rather a prospective work, so to speak. It will develop over the whole runtime of the exhibition.
Also, the 66 video program includes some of the ocean waving images, which resonate really well with Lily Dujury's work. And some of the cityscapes of the Paris too, when city was empty during the COVID lockdown time.
Yeah, And also we should not forget that the people who were invited for performance, it's not some kind of an exclusive invitation to just some people. It was really it's a very broad group of super diverse people from everywhere, people who wanted to do a poem or
And then
wanted to perform a poem.
also using in different languages, and then not necessarily everything is translated. But I think it's interesting and important to remind it that not everyone is speaking the same language, and we live in we need to seek for the harmony within all those differences without understanding the languages.
Yeah, and because that's also maybe an interesting connection. It in a way it connects to exile again, exile as a state of being, because Sungi is living close to Paris. By the way, such as Lily Dugery in a larger house, not in a space room of its own, like Virginia Woolf told it, but in a real kind of in a house in the nature, and in a way that's also a certain exile, I would say, and she probably she experienced her life also as an exile, as a Korean in France since the early 70s. And I think so living beyond language is a very interesting state of being. I mean, Lost in Translation is of course a rather pop cultural phenomenon, but this is why she didn't want to subtitle it, because language also has an aesthetic form.
That's right.
Beyond semiotics, semantics.
And also the next artist, Annabella Gallo, who travel like all around the world and making a new piece. And for this show, she made a new commission called Silk Road, which is this.
I thought it was very interesting for her to start making a new piece during a COVID time, because she's always someone who is always constantly traveling and doing the research of the local histories. But because of this restriction that she couldn't really travel to Japan or did do enough research, but she does read a lot, and she has a pile of books and going through different readings. So to connect where she is in Kailo and Japan, that she was she was interested in the history of the Silk Road that really connects the overreaching from Asia and Europe. So she found out that Japan's modernization after Meiji Restoration was supported largely by silk industry, which they could sell to the Europe. Then so Silk Road was making a lot of traffic. So her cutouts storytelling is starting from the different camels and merchant carrying the products, then going through Japanese national factory for silk industry, and all these young ladies working long hours, and French technician came to teach, and all this little story continues until she found that the current major company in Japan, Toyota, and founder of Toyota's father invented one of the first automatic textile machine. So that whole connection that she found as one story then appears as the drawings, and then also hanging from the ceiling together with some of the silk thread. And it's a beautiful way of telling a story and visual storytelling.
Yeah, and she's also putting history or factual history back on eye level in a certain way, so that every visitor can mix it up anew. I think for her, it's not really to replace facts through fiction, but to offer some kind of an alternative reading of reality also, because she knows about the relativity of her own vision, but she reminds us that everything we consider as stable is part of a flux and is part of permanent change, so to speak. And that's maybe also a result of her living as a nomad in a way, because she's opening up history again and putting it on eye level. And what I also appreciate a lot about her work is that it doesn't really care too much about certain modernist registers of art making. So it's a very direct and readable work on the one hand, but still it makes use of traditional forms of art making. So it's on the one hand it's very direct, and on the other hand it connects deep in the history of encaustic she's using. So traditional Arab techniques of image making, and she's combining that. So it's very, very interesting.
And then also talking about the history, that by using this mirror on the floor, so she could easily reverse the story that she was writing or depicting.
Exactly. That was the notion of the relativity in that vision.
Shall we go to the next room?
One. I think minimalist expression is also the common feature of several artists, as you see Lily. And in the next room has 3 artists. They all makes influenced by minimalist expression. And starting with Nunun WS from Indonesia.
I was introduced to Nunun WS during our research process. And I was inspired and impressed by Nunun's practices. And she's probably not really known internationally at all, but her minimalistic expression comes from her Muslim background that sort of prohibit figurative depiction. And but these again going back to Ethel Adnan or Lily Dujury's poetic gesture to look at the landscape of islands, Indonesian islands and Java islands, and then also traditional textile pattern and the colors. And color also comes from natural plants and trees and color of the ocean and the sky, but as well as her internal landscape, that she talks about the spirituality in her works, that how one could depict internal mindscape onto these visual language. And that speaks quite interesting with Carmen Herrera. Maybe Martin, you can talk about Carmen.
Carmen Herrera, who is actually the artist with the longest career in the exhibition by now. Who actually, I think she studied architecture first, and then she moved to New York in 1939, as far as I remember, and then she became acquainted also with all the important artists at the time there, and slowly she started her own practice, which was always influenced by the trends of the time. So you can see this, you can see the how the work slowly develops into a very step by step, actually, you could say, in a very own version of minimalism, into a kind of minimalism which also is remaining on eye level and which is remaining quirky and itchy in a certain way. And I think that's it took. What did she say? She said, I just waited for the bus and it came.
She said there is a saying that if you wait for the bus will come. And I waited for almost a century and it came.
And so that's a particular. She's actually, in that sense, the artist whose career spanned most art historical periods and touches most of those periods. But also, she's the female artist who knew everyone, but who was important. Artists, friends, museum people in New York, but was never really discovered, or whose work was never really embraced. And recently it happened. And in the meantime, her standing is absolutely acknowledged. And then what's probably most important is that she never wanted to be acknowledged as the female Cuban American painter. She wanted to be acknowledged as a painter, as an artist. And I think that's a huge difference. And maybe that stubbornness also is responsible that she couldn't be discovered earlier, that she didn't work towards certain expectations. And so sometimes opacity is also productive, because artists can really develop their own practice more precise if there's not this pressure of being public. But anyway, she's if we abstraction and minimalism or way, that's actually the core theme of the 20th century. And I think the whole space is actually circumnavigating around that major 20th century theme. And we can say the same about Kazuko Miyamoto, who also went to New York, but later, not in the 30s. I think she was not even born then.
Yeah,
That's also
she went to New York in 60s. And it was also our interesting finding that she was one of the first assistant for Sol LeWitt, the very important figure for minimalism and conceptualism. And but while under the working under Sol LeWitt, she actually invented her own system, particularly in 70s, to only use nails and thread. And she started to using these nails on her apartment walls and then start connecting with the strings. But it's somehow, like many other artists in the show, somehow it's her own method and no one else did it. And it's minimal, but very, very unique. But also, Martin, you can explore more, but we are showing more works from 70s. But later, her practice also changes, just like to have the different balance.
Yeah, and what I think is also what is important, we know or we knew or we perceived her very long as assistant of Sol LeWitt. So, and then what does that mean actually? What does that mean in terms of categorization? I think right now we live somehow in a time where we could say, but that's even important for the work as Sol LeWitt's work himself. And it's actually a moment where these relations, these hierarchical relations, slowly disappear and pop up. And I think if you take, for example, Derrida, who says a sentence sentence in language consists of each important parts, like a comma, a word, in between word, then you could also say this supporting work is of even importance of the work of Sol LeWitt himself as the works. And these are the processes which are in the flux now. And I think that's quite interesting. And we show only the half of her practice. Actually, we show what she could do in the 70s, because later on the work became more rough, more physical. She also worked a lot in performance, in live performances such as Senga Nengudi. So we only show actually one part of her practice.
Yeah, continuation from Kazuko Miyamoto's performance, I think it's interesting to see Senga Nengudi studied sculpture and then also dance. And in 60s, while Black artist movements are still sort of quite active, then she also encountered the Gutai Artists Association in Japan through the book. And she even decided to come to Japan to stay for a year in 1960s. Then she continuously, while being aware of the politicality of the art, but at the same time, she kept being abstract or probably undercovering the criticism, but using different materials. And the one piece that we are showing at the end of the corridor is called the water construction. And that piece is particularly referring to one of the Gutai artists, Motonaga, Sadamasa Motonaga. And Motonaga made a work called the Work Bracket Water in 1956. And so she refers to the piece and using this strongly sealed plastic and rope, then colored water. It's quite a beautiful piece, but also it doesn't stay in the same form in a way. So she was interested in always changing form and not solid form. And that relates to her performance work together with her representative series called the RSVP, using the panty hole. But that comes from her experience of a pregnancy of the first son, of her own body expanded and comes back, so that the human body's elasticity became one of her major concern and interest. And that really continues to her another piece in the show called the Warp Trance, that she was staying in Philadelphia and recorded that image. Yeah, this one. Yeah, she recorded the images of the Jagged machine, this factory, the machinery movement that somehow relates to Anna Bogigian's silk industry somehow. But all this factories movement was quite beautiful, and then she's using this paper template of the factory machine, and which has a different designed holes to make this jagged pattern. But that holes brings the light to go through and project onto the background of the screen. So it's about the movement, and then also the different layers and colors. Yeah, it has a lot of layers.
Yeah, and it also plays, of course, with industrial production and the standing of the human being within those larger processes. And it's about work and about relationships between companies and workers. And so it also goes to the Black community, and then further back to cotton plucking. And you can draw many connections actually from that work to within the history of the US and also industrialization.
Mm-hmm.
And she's kind of, yeah, returning that work to the body, because people are also allowed to dance in that space if they like to.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we can move on to the next artist, Miriam Kang.
Martin, I think yeah, you can refer to her practice in terms of the eye level that you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, first it was a very, very interesting situation when I visited her to make the selection of works, because somehow we spoke about the space, and she had some first ideas how her space could look like, and but she created some kind of an interesting game in which I could choose the works, not that she was choosing her works. So from the beginning, she produced some kind of eye level in the collaboration, how we would make the room. And that was really fascinating. She's living in a in a studio space, which consists largely of her painting studio and just a very small private living area. So she really lives her work, so to speak. And she constantly went into her depot and took out new paintings, and I had to say yes or no. But which ones was, of course, her decision. So it was a very interesting process of coming to the selection. However, what we see on those images or on those paintings is various situations from refugees who had to leave home. We also see portraits, but we also see portraits of animals and many. Yeah, it's an entire cosmos, I think, which is somehow connected to the painterly language, which is very direct, but also connected through this hanging works on eye level, on human eye level. And this is probably something she also politically wants to reach out with her practice for, to find some kind of, to explore the notion of eye level, not only between human beings, but also between human beings and animals, to let somehow oppositions of nature and culture disappear gradually. And I think even if the work by Miriam Khan comes from the feminist movement, because we have to consider that only in 1971 women were allowed to vote in Switzerland. Even if it comes from there, she was able to adapt it due the course of time, because basically she stands in for the human being and not for the female human being. And that's also very interesting about how she adapts her practice to the necessity of the times. And she says some fights are fought yet, and now we have to look out for other things. And you worked with her in Sydney, right?
Yes. So I did the same experience of selecting works at his studio. And but I was sort of astonished by the surroundings, that she lives really on a mountainside. So she's every day facing to the Alpine mountains. And then I thought that would keeps her thinking like how humble the human beings are. And then again, it echoes with the idea of Ethel Adnan and Kim Sungi, that we are really part of the larger universe. And she paints very sort of primitive motifs like human figure and house and flower and animals. But as you mentioned, that everything is equal and then everything is evenly sort of distributed in a way. And aesthetics is also quite important. That everything's very beautiful. That she also takes some photographic works as well as the large charcoal drawings that we are not showing. But any medium is equal to her. That there's no hierarchy, and that is also something quite consistent throughout these artists in the show.
Yeah, and you also have actually the whole everything between the human figure and abstraction is part of her work, but all those these categories basically disappear within the practice. That's also quite. You have abstraction, you have figuration, you have representation, but it becomes some kind of a whole, a totality of her work in which those differences are not so important anymore.
I also want to mention one small painting on the left with a lady with yellow hair and red lipsticks, which we have been using for our promotional materials. And because in the poster it's a giant face, but actually it's a subtle small piece. So that just wanted to share with the listeners.
The next artist is Beatrice Gondares. The Beatrice is kind of different from other artists in a way that her practice is more direct, politically engaged. So, Martin, could you explain this poster piece? And also, like to her work, it is important to mention that printing technology that have becomes common in 1960s and 70s are very important. Repetition of the same image in terms of like pop art, relation to the pop art too.
First of all, I think Beatrice, although we could associate her work with pop art because she's making use of print of reproduction. We could not logically describe it as pop art in this typical American British pop art way, sense. And also she herself, she said that she was in 1964 in an exhibition in Amsterdam, and that she also saw pop art, canonical pop or now canonical pop art works, but she was not really so impressed by it. Although on the other hand, the reproduction plays a very important role by her, because in the beginning of her career, she often made remakes of paintings from the classic painting history, like Leonardo da Vinci. So she made those remakes, actually beginning from the time when South America was colonized by the Europeans, which is a very interesting artistic maneuver. So she was playing with the way how the image politics of the so-called center were coming to the so-called periphery of that time, or also of the 60s and 70s when she worked, which was Colombia, of course. And so pop art is something we could associate it with today, but it's not in her vision. I think it's not so important. And about this particular works here, the work of Beatrice is I think a very political one, or a political, even in a, I wouldn't call it directly activist, but engaged, however, and especially those so-called socalos here, they refer to a body of work she started already in the 80s, when she there was a president in Colombia whose name was, let me check briefly, I forgot his name. President Betancourt, someone who was really absolutely obsessed with national identity, and somehow she made works in the public space reacting to that in this typical Zocalo format, what we see here. And later on, she made new versions of those works by taking the shape and the form of these printed posters, but then with women who were in Trauer. Sorry, I forgot. Who were mourning. So she made use of a strategy she established before, the strategy to somehow mock and to kind of play a loudspeaker for the president, to fill it with her own content. And the silhouette and the filling of political content was always an important part of her practice. Also with her furniture sculptures, where she's replacing mirrors, also with mourning women's, or the wallpapers. So you have to think that she actually expanded painting, in the living space. So her painting intruded, basically, it went away from the canvas and intruded the mundane life. And this is actually a very interesting strategy. And with that, she's trying to use art as a vehicle for collective memories. So memory as a state is not able to create a space for, due to its own self-referentialities. Beatriz Gonzalez is using art to open these spaces for the people to create collective memory. Maybe Mami wants to say something about this, about the piece on the cemetery.
Yeah, I think the use of those mourning women in sorrow is quite interesting to in a sense that the repetition of these images are something that we can see from in the Alpita-Sin's work, but also the taking those images from newspaper and magazines. So it's everyday media that we are looking at. So she take those images and then making poster and then place them outdoor. So bringing those collective incidents or memories of history, and then embracing into her work, and then returning to the public again. So I was fascinated by that sort of cycle. And in this silhouette, this one and also the one behind, is the people carrying the dead bodies and corpse, the people who died, the citizens who died through the Civil War. Then there was the Bogota Central Cemetery. Then there was a discussion that that place was going to be demolished and then changed to the soccer playing the yard. Then she was fighting not to destroy that cemetery and then painting all that silhouette. And then I think by using this repeated imageries of the silhouette, that individual becomes sort of anonymous, so that anonymity makes could be applied for everyone, and then anyone could be that part of the silhouette. And that's again, she invented her own system of art making. And it's amazing that no one else she's not probably even thinking about the pop art, and it's her own system that she invented.
Yeah, that's what I meant in the beginning, that we can read it in the registers of pop art, but basically that's not the important part for her.
Yeah, and it's interesting to have a repetition of the images of her next to Arpita Singh, that the artist that we talked about earlier. But she also uses the repeated same figure in one paintings, so that again it could be everybody, anyone in the city. And she also takes those texts and the words from billboard and the newspaper and the magazines. So all this flooded information is surrounding her, and she's looking at the society with the critical view, and then taking some issues and then embracing into her works. I think we can go to Kimio Mishima, that she also used the newspaper and an idea of information starting already in 60s. That the earlier works in 60s that she was using the techniques of collage, using textile and newspaper and a magazine cutouts. But then she was also thinking about the future of the information, and the information age was coming. Then there was a sort of very abstract, invisible fear that she was feeling, and the future could be quite vulnerable and weak. Then she needed to find out something that the information could be expressed as something vulnerable. Then she sort of invented herself to use the ceramics to make newspaper could be breakable and burnable. And so that became her important method and technique. Then she started to be invited to ceramic exhibition and then also print exhibition categorized by medium. And she was trying to avoid included in those exhibitions, and then also included in a women's show. Then she's like, no, I'm not a ceramicist. I'm not a printmaker. I'm not, I don't want to be categorized as a women artist. But she just said, I was just playing around. I was just doing what I wanted, and I wanted to explore. So this piece, all with ceramic newspaper that she made for this show, and she's actually 89 years old, but she said, oh, if there is a 105 years old artist in the show, I have to work and make a new piece. So this is a stunning new piece that she was firing in her kirin in Osaka during COVID time in 2020. It's really amazing piece.
Yeah, I liked it very much when we visited her in her studio, and when she was telling how she started actually with the ceramic works. And that's so interesting how sometimes artists' works get into a new direction, because she told us that she was walking down the street and she saw a piece of newspaper which was kind of put together, and she had this imagination that what would happen if I would step on it and it would crack. And it was this very short moment when actually this whole body of work she invented since then unfolded. And of course, as you said before, it was always read towards the ceramicist traditions, and she was invited to ceramicist exhibitions. But the work is totally not about that.
Yeah.
It's rather, let's say, in the same way how Lily Dujury uses pastel to make abstract works, she's using ceramics to make that kind of work. So it's kind of a little bit a misuse of categories these artists do. And then I also think that Kimiyo Mishima's work has a lot to do with today, with this kind of, it's not that we really, on the one hand, we left the analog age and we are flooded with other information, but I think also for that, those works still stand in. So this is, I think it's very contemporary work.
Yeah, I'm happy to end the show with this very powerful new piece.
It was very inspiring working with her, Mishima Kimiyo. And she said, actually, she had some injury on her leg now. So it's now she sometimes like had to sit on the wheelchair. And then she told me that she need to work on her own leg to work on this ceramic work. Then I asked her like, oh, what would you do if you cannot work with the ceramic anymore? She said like she wants to start the music. She wants to start like a new expression, and that was like really inspiring because she's already 89-year old, but she still keep thinking about making something new and also like trying something new never experienced before. So yeah, it was such an inspiring experience with working with her. So we have only 3 minutes left. Then I think most of the listeners never visited Another Energy yet. So I want you to send a short message to someone who are thinking coming to see the show now. So what is the point? What you want them to come away with this Another Energy?
Martin.
Maybe Martin, you can start.
Yeah, first of all, I think we made a bold contemporary art exhibition. And this is probably the major point of this show, that it's an exhibition which shows on the one hand women who are between 73 and 106 in the meantime, I think, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that it is really not about that. It is rather about the fact in how far these artists, because what they also all have in common is that they are artists, and that's probably the major important thing, in how far these artists are able to transgress art historical reading, to transgress categories, and to really develop their work under whichever circumstances. And work which is very energetic, very clear, stands very much for its own, and work which also challenges us as museums. And I think that's something I would like the visitors to take away with, that we are actually in the moment of where things change, and that it's a perfect moment not to always look to the future and being obsessed with the young and the new, but that it's also a good moment, now that we are in a time of an international pandemic, to look back in the last 30 or 60 years, which recipes did we have and did we not really try out, because these artists witnessed it all. And I think that's so interesting.
I think, as you said, Martin, the world is upside down now. So the old could be new, and all the categories that we are trying to sort of analyze, how artists are working, all the medium and isms and categories can be freed again. Then we open up those fixed thinking or way of analyzing artist practices and just start from who they are. And I think our visitors could enjoy small monitors in front of everyone's room, that we have short video interviews. Then just sort of going back and forth between the work and also their history and how they talk and their thinking. And I think it's stimulating exhibition to all of us to think about idea of identity and then also explore our imagination from what we see and through these visual languages. And it's not only for women, but for all genders and in all ages. So I would love for everyone to come and see the show.
Okay. Thank you, Marty and Mami. So we have to close the curator's talk today. Today's Japanese English interpreters are Ampo Naoko-san and Watanabe Yuko-san. And thank you for watching.